But there truly is a way. In fact, being a Franciscan tertiary, I'm able to frequently watch sisters, religious sisters, and friars and see what their patterns are and be able to understand them, create a baseline, and then implement them. Hello, everyone. Today's episode is about a baseline of prayer that all Catholics should have, regardless of where you're at. And this baseline, this basics, is important and vital to grow in spirituality.
Welcome to another episode of Practical Catholic with David Cease. Practical Catholic is a spiritual coaching show to help you find peace, love, and joy in family and work life. We are here each and every week to help you grow spiritually, to become successful in this life, and to be a saint for the life after.
My story begins with being in the Marines. One of the things that was very exciting about being in the Marines is being able to shoot with a rifle. In fact, Marines are known to be the best shot. And not to be bragging, but I was considered an expert in the rifle range. That means, and I'm always proud to say, is that there's an 80% chance that I could kill anyone 500 yards away. So it was it's something very neat to have, and not many people have it. So I remember when we first went to the rifle range. It's about rifle range is the second phase. As I mentioned earlier, Marine boot camp is broken down into 3 phases. And so the rifle range is in the second phase. And I remember when the drill instructor said, we're moving out to go to basically weapons area to go to train weapons, we were excited. I was ecstatic because you're carrying this, you're marching with the M16, you're carrying the M16, but you're not using it. You've joined the military, and for about 6 whole months, you're doing everything with your rifle, but not using it. All right. So we go to weapons area, and it's a different barracks, so we had to stay there. And the first week, and you're so excited that you're going to be firing your weapons, but you don't. It's called Grass Week. And all Grass Week is learning how to sit and stand and lay down with your rifle. That's all it is. It's called basically you're practicing your posture. That's what you're doing. You're practicing the posture in the way that you handle and hold your weapon as you're sighting it in. So you never get to fire the weapon. You never get to, load your weapon with real bullets. It's basically an empty weapon, and you're in these awkward, extremely painful positions during that whole week. Now, you might say to yourself, why did they do that? Well, the reason why they did that was because before you go in the rifle range and start firing real bullets, they want to make sure that you're comfortable in the various positions of the rifle, whether it's standing, whether it's sitting, whether it's lying down. It's very awkward. And to be a good shot, you have to create what they call a hasty sling, or the sling kind of counterbalances that rifle. And the sling is on really tight. In fact, the tighter it is, the better it is, because it prevents the rifle from moving. So it's a very painful situation. And in the beginning, it was very disappointing, because you would think that for a whole week, you would at least start firing the rifle, but you don't. But Grass Week is very, very important, because if you do Grass Week correctly, it will pay off on the rifle range, which it did for me. So I'm sitting, we would be there for hours in the beating sun in these awkward positions with our M16, sighting in our rifle to these barrels that had little pictures of what the targets would look like. And it was very painful. But it did pay off. That's one of the reasons why I became an expert at the rifle range. And so any great, Marine will tell you that learning the postures, learning the basics is the key important aspects of learning how to fire a rifle. If you play any sports, I think if you listen to commentators, when you listen to sports, they'll tell you you have to get back to the basics. When a team starts falling apart and collapsing, almost every commentator of sports will say, this team needs to go back to the basics. They need to go back to understanding the fundamentals. And so today's topic is really about that. What is the fundamentals in prayer life? What is it? What are the aspect of a prayer life that would have us understand what we truly need to know, especially the basics? And here are the basics that I wrote down, which I think is very, very important. Now, this is from a humanistic standpoint. We as Catholics control our destiny in prayer. Now, we don't finalize prayer. God does. God takes us up and elevates us. But we are the beginners of that. And so the basics of prayer, and here I brought the basics that we have to understand and have is this. The first is being regimented. And I'll go through these one by one more in depth. The second is silence. There has to be a level of silence. Now, that doesn't mean no sound in the outside world, but I will talk a little bit more briefly about what silence really is. Posture. How we sit, stand, and kneel really takes an important part. Spiritual reading. Spiritual reading is the precursor of prayer and is the fuel for prayer. Use of our imagination. Use of our emotions. This is something that some people might not really like, is using our emotions. But emotions are important. Slowing, the other one is called conscientious praying. Learning how to conscientiously pray and understand what you're really saying, okay? So those are the basic fundamentals that people need to grasp and understand, all right, from a humanistic standpoint, all right? I know so many people I've talked to talk about all these things about, the mystical life and the, how union with God, and they love all this high, great things, but they fail on the basics. It all winds up being talk rather than really trying to gain that prayerful spirit, that prayerful basics so that they can grow in spirituality. So very important. Or you get sometimes Catholics who really don't know what the prayerful basics are. So it winds up being, what I would call just praying some, vocal prayers and then that's it. And they don't grow either. So it's one who thinks too lofty without having good foundation. And then you have ones that are too basic in a sense. They reduce it to just novenas and some a prayer book that they have. So let's go one by one on each one of these, okay? So being regimented. This is so key to a prayer life, is being regimented. This is, I would say, the basics of the basics is being regimented. What does that mean? That means you should have a schedule of prayer. You should have something, in the Marines, if you look at any military force, an excellent military force will always be a regimented force. They wake up at a certain time. They go to bed at a certain time. They actually control people, the troops' lives, literally hour by hour. In boot camp, there was not a single minute that would not have been wasted or was not on a scheduled pattern. And most of the patterns were pretty much the same. So being regimented helps out. Why does it help out? One is the fact that being regimented doesn't avoids what I call the guessing game. All right. Scientifically speaking, there was a study on inner city kids, and they found that inner city kids actually liked Mr. Rogers. It was one of the favorite shows. And when they asked that, they said, "Why do you like Mr. Rogers?" And They basically said because he was predictable. Mr. Rogers was very predictable and regimented. He always went in, walked through that same door, changed his sneakers, changed his jacket. The pattern of the stories were all the same. It was very regimented, especially in inner cities where, they wouldn't even know where their mother was or where their father was, or people were coming in and out and they didn't even care. It was not very regimented. And so regimentality brings a lot of peace into our hearts. Just simple little regimented life. And that's what the religious life does. That's what even Eastern mysticism does. It creates this calmness, this peace. All right. So you got to bring a level of regimentality into your life. And when you do that, you'll definitely bring some peace. Now, I'm not going to say in the beginning that it's the easiest thing in the world to do. I'm not going to say that's fairly easy in the secular world. But you can create a time in which you integrate your prayer life as well as integrate some peace and quiet. So when we do that, you'll find that peace will come into it. And it's an act of the will. You have to will this. This is not something that's going to come very easy. And you have to sit down and say, when can I do morning prayer? When can I do evening prayer? And you should sit down and figure out what are the prayers that you're going to do. The most excellent prayer that you can do, they become two hinges in the morning and in evening, is typically the liturgy of the hours. So you can do the liturgy of the hours, do Christian prayer, and you can buy the prayer online. But you would use that as the morning and the evening cycle, and bring that in. It only takes about 15 minutes. It's not that difficult. The other is doing a morning offering prayer and an evening prayer. An evening, you should do minimally at least an examination of conscience. And that could be a night prayer where you just simply do some form of examining your conscience and then a small little, evening prayer that wraps up the evening. In the afternoon, do an Angelus. It's a simple prayer. Takes no more than 2 minutes to do. And, that's what you do. So, and you say to yourself, oh, that's so hard. I can't do that. It really isn't once you start creating a good habit and you actually write down that regimented area. So I think a lot of us wouldn't want to miss a doctor's appointment or miss a meeting at work or maybe driving our kids to school. They're just as much of a deadline and regimentality as anything else, a schedule. So put in your schedule, your prayer life. So if you're a mother and, you have to take your kids to school, well, you can say, you know what? I have to, typically right now, most mothers have to wake up in the morning, cook their kids their breakfast, make sure they're at the bus, or maybe they drive them to the school. Well, you know what you can do is you can say, before I make them breakfast, I'll do 15 minutes of morning prayer or of liturgy of the hours. If you can't even do that, then just do some form of morning offering prayer in there, which would only take about 2 or 3 minutes. So inserting that in there into your afternoon. In the afternoon, everyone has to eat lunch, right? Just do an Angelus. An Angelus will take no more than 2 minutes to do. So you're putting things in your life in that regimentality. And make sure you write it down. The key thing to regimenting your life is to actually write it down. I've written it down plenty of times, and I highly recommend that you write it down. I'm a firm believer in that things start seeping in when you write it down. And I highly recommend writing it down with your hand, not just on the computer, but with your hand, and writing it down, and then you can type it up in the computer. And then always remind yourself of that, because especially in the beginning, because it'll be difficult to follow every time. So let's talk about the next item, which is silence. Now, silence is very, very important, but I want to distinguish the difference between silence and no noise. We sometimes think silence is no noise. And if that was the case, that would be very, very difficult. Now, the utopia is that there is no silence. No noise that brings about the silence. But in many cases, that typically does not happen, especially in the secular world. Now, again, let me reemphasize that the best thing is to have no noise as silence. But you're going to probably live, if you have a family or if you have, no time to go to a mass or a church, that it's going to have some level of noise. But we can block that out. It's the human mind is so, amazing how it can block it out. We can block out noise very easily. Yes, it could cause a distraction, but we can block it out. You want to hear something funny? We went to a friend of ours' house, and they're deeply devout. In fact, the husband is a deacon, from a deacon. And we went out for dinner. We went to dinner over their house. And I don't know if you know, but sometimes you have these fire alarms that starts chirping when the fire alarm needs the battery replaced. It's to notify you that the battery of this fire alarm needs to be replaced. And so it was chirping, chirp, chirp. And I know it was bothering my wife, And so right before she left, she mentioned to the house guest to say, hey, I think you need to change the battery in your fire alarm. And she goes, what do you mean? And my wife said, well, because your fire alarm is chirping, and that's a sign that it is, that you need to change the battery. And our friend starts laughing, and she says, I don't even hear it anymore. I'm so used to it that I don't hear the chirping anymore. So that's exactly it. So we don't need to have no noise. We just don't need to be bothered by it. So that's controlling our I would say, our emotions and our external senses. We have the power to control our external senses. And we and the Marines notice that as well. There's importance to understand that we can control it, okay, and not let it bother us. All right? Now, we're not asking people to do crazy things, but sometimes you can. I've meditated in a busy airport. I've meditated in a busy train. How about when you go to mass? When you hear kids, crying or people talking or doing whatever, you want to be able to focus directly on what is going on. So you don't need to have, so silence here doesn't mean so much no sound, though that would be the utopia. I'm not saying that don't do it. But I know people who literally there's no sound, but they can hear like the clock ticking, or they can hear birds chirping and it's bothering them, right? I went to an outside mass one time and the birds were chirping. It's a very beautiful sound, but even that could be distracting. So the key here is silence in our heart, silence caused by controlling our external senses and not allowing them to annoy you or bother you. Now that's going to take a while. But again, the best way of doing that is just calming our heart rate, calming our body. That's the key to anything. And deep breaths. I'm a big firm believer in deep breaths to calm our bodies down. And that's what you need to do, is to take these deep breaths. So the way, when we say, true silence is a silence in our heart and in our mind caused by calming our external senses down. We can begin by just taking deep breaths, just in and out, and relaxing our bodies. Because The noise is distracting, and it creates an annoyance, and that annoyance is really coming from our external senses. So the next element of that we can talk about is posture. Posture is incredibly important because, a lot of times we go to mass and you're supposed to bow in the creed and you're supposed to make the sign of the cross. We're supposed to sit, stand, and kneel. And a lot of people get annoyed that we have to do all these things. And some people don't even know what they're supposed to be doing. But posture is important, not because, we're doing adoration to God, and that's important as well, that, we kneel because we're adoring Christ. But posture is not just an outward sign, but it's also an interior behavior that helps us move our heart. When we kneel, at the consecration, there's a deep movement inside of our heart. Look at when we kiss someone, all right? When I kiss my daughter, good night, every night, or at least most of the nights, there's a deep affection and love for my daughter that occurs just by that action, all right? Just by certain things. That's why God gave us a body. God gave us a body so that we can feel the effects of our movements, whether it's a hug, whether it's a kiss, and they could be evil or good. In those cases, so an evil might be a hit, a punch, but the good is a hug and a kiss, holding hands. And so when we do these actions, we actually feel the emotion. We actually feel the love that occurs in a good action and the hate that occurs in a bad action. So it's important that we use our body to have an interior sense of prayer. So kneeling, standing, walking, all of these help our interior life. So there's a lot of times where I will kneel because it just gives me this great feeling of adoration towards our God, our all-powerful, our all-knowing God. I will sometimes walk when I do the Liturgy of the Hours, especially in the evenings, because sometimes I'm so tired that the way to keep me up is to actually walk. A lot of times people want to lay down. And for me, I think that that's not a really good thing to do because it, promotes too much peace and people want to fall asleep. So that's not a good thing either. So posture is very, very important in our spiritual life. The next thing that is important in the baseline of a good prayer life is spiritual reading. Now, that doesn't mean that you should be, you need to go and read St. Thomas Aquinas, tomorrow. In fact, I wouldn't recommend that at all. But it does mean what you should be doing is reading at least the Bible. That is so important to do, is to read the Bible. The Bible is one of those things where if you don't read it, it's going to be hard for us to kind of pray. Mainly because you don't really know Jesus unless you kind of know him through the Bible. So the Bible is important for us to pray, or not to pray, but to read. And I would read a little bit every day. Make maybe a concerted effort to read the Bible, even if it's 5 or 10 minutes a day before you go to bed. Just read the Bible, see what it's all about, and understand that you can actually get to know Jesus a lot better. And I know that if you go to Mass that you get to read the Bible, but reading the Bible in almost like a contiguous beginning to end will really help you fully understand the Bible. Other things to read are the great saints and their interpretation of the Bible and their understanding of God and everything else that goes on with it. So it's important for us to have some scriptural reading in our lives and not just be, saying prayers and everything else. It gives us the fodder, or I call it fodder, but raw materials for our prayer life. especially when we start going into meditation. And when we go into meditation, you're really going to see that it becomes fuel for your prayer life. So the other thing it does in our spiritual life is that it gives us a better understanding in full meditation that you wouldn't be able to get just in the prayers itself. Because sometimes the prayers of themselves are very short, and you might not fully understand what their meanings are. Sometimes even just using a dictionary to help out understand what are these words that this prayer is trying to say will help out as well. So integrating a certain level of spiritual reading will help out greatly. The next baseline item is in the prayer life is the use of the imagination. This is probably one of the most fundamental and most important part of a prayer. Remember that prayer is an elevation of the mind, and part of elevation of our intellect is using our imagination. Now, I know sometimes we get the idea that imagination is using all of our, we get confused that imagination is artsy, it's all about art. But it really isn't. The use of the imagination is, if you look at our, if you listen to my other podcasts or other episodes, it's the idea that we can formulate ideas through our imaginations and then use those ideas to create judgments, and then those judgments create deductive reasoning, so we can reason out of it. So ideas, judgments, and reasoning. And so we can do that through our prayer life, and it's very important to do that because a lot of times I find people who quote great theologians like Scott Hahn or Marcus Rhodey, or Mother Angelica, or all the great saints. But when you ask them, like, what does that mean to you? What, how do can you explain that to me? They really don't. They're just basically a recorder. And God didn't give us an intellect so that we could just use our memory to record things and to quote people and think that's great. But he gave us an intellect so we can elevate our prayer life to him through our intellect and most specifically our imagination. So we are called to actually use our imagination when we pray. So a lot of times people just leave it at the level of vocal prayer where they're just saying words, almost as if it's an incantation to make things happen, right? As opposed to really elevating our mind and our intellect to God. So how do we do that? How do we use our imagination? Well, one of the easiest rules that I tell people is just to play it out. When you're saying a prayer, play it out. We do when this idea of playing it out, we use a lot of it, especially in white collar jobs where, if you're a sales or a marketing person, you have to play out. You have to plan out what could all the things happen when you do a marketing plan or a sales plan. What are the threats out there? What can happen? That's called playing it out. You're actually envisioning or imagining you doing this and seeing what would happen if this happened or if that happened or could this work. Lawyers use it a lot. It's called almost like a diatribe where they're playing out the cases in front of them, the trial in front of them, and wonder what the opponent is going to say. So you're playing it out. That's what you do. So how can you play it out in prayer? Well, if you were to pray, the Our Father who art in heaven, well, play it out. What does it mean to be a father? What does it mean? Maybe you can use your own father as an example. I had a wonderful father, and he gives me great examples of what a good father is. So you can really, really play things out when we use our imaginations and when we come to deductive reasoning. And I'll give you an example. Let's say you're meditating on Our Lady, taking a donkey from, one place to Bethlehem. And in there you realize, you play it out. You say, wow, she was on a donkey for days and days and days. And it must have really hurt her bottom. I rode a bicycle, I think 200 miles away, and it hurt my bottom after I was done. Imagine her. She didn't complain. She didn't gripe. She didn't say, oh, St. Joseph, why couldn't you just give me some, caravan that has suspensions on it that I can go a lot better? Or, well, God, why couldn't you give me, better technology than what I have on this donkey? And so there was no complaints. So how are we to complain when we're at Mass and maybe we're sitting next to someone that we don't like to sit next to, or someone who's bothering us? We cannot sit for 1 hour of Mass? Well, she did it for days to get to Bethlehem. That's playing it out. That's what we mean by playing it out, making it real in front of our eyes. This is what the use of our imagination is to help us bring alive something that we read. All right. So we have this idea that, prayer is just what we say and not what we think and not what we use our imagination and our intellect to do. So use of the intellect is very important. So what else can we use? So another baseline is using our emotions. Now I use that analogy. There's, when we see a movie, a really good movie, why do we like that movie? Because it makes us emotional. We go through the emotional roller coaster. If you look at Oprah Winfrey, now I'm not a big fan of Oprah Winfrey, but Oprah Winfrey loves to toy with emotions. That's basically what it is. Especially the topics and things that she does, is basically toying with your emotions. And that's not really good, because emotion should have some finality, some form of action towards it, right? I hate to say this, but, excuse my term, but I call something like Oprah Winfrey emotional masturbation, in which we get the joy of the emotion, but never the action that it's supposed to bring with it. Real emotions, okay, are supposed to bring something along with it, some form of act. Like, for example, if you feel sorrow for a situation, you're supposed to take an action on it. Give that person a hug, okay? But a lot of times, movies and shows just create emotions that we enjoy, but we don't have to act upon it. We don't have to do anything about it, all right? As opposed to real emotions are meant to act. When my daughter's sad, to do something about it. When my son is hurt, do something about it. All right, whether it's praying, whether it's coming to the rescue, whatever it is. So, but we can take those same emotions and put it in our prayer life. We really can. And we have to be open to emotions. A lot of times you get people who are like, no emotions. Nope, we're just supposed to be doing our vocal prayers and that's it. But in the ascetical way, the third gradation is called affective prayer. Affective means affectionate, where we get affection from. And how do we get affection? Through our emotions. Okay? No, because when we're affectionate to someone, we have a certain amount of emotional tie-in to it. All right? When I have a certain affection for my father, but that's because I have an emotional tie to my father, a good one, a good emotional tie, or to my wife, or to my children. They make us emotionally attached. And that's good to have. That's what we want. So that we don't disappoint God. So that when we commit a sin, we know through our affection towards God that that's bad. Because people who don't get to this level of the affectionate prayer in the ascetical life wind up having God as a fire insurance. Like, I don't want to go to hell. As opposed to, I really don't want to disappoint God, because I have this affection towards him. I have this love. Like a dog has an affection towards his master. There's an affection towards us. All right, that loving bond. So the emotion is what helps us get to that level. So it's important that we have some form of emotional tie-in with it. So how can we tie emotions to it? The best way to tie emotions to our thoughts and our prayers is to assimilate some favorable emotion, feeling that you have that is similar to that prayer. You know, so if you say the Our Father, if you had a good relationship with your father, or you read about a good relationship, or you saw a good movie, try to relate that emotion towards it. And that will help you elevate that emotion that's there. Okay. So if you can relate certain emotions that you felt when you had, you've experienced, then you can elevate that out. Maybe even using a movie, to help you out with that. All right. So the next baseline is what I would call conscientious praying. A lot of times the reason why people leave their prayer life at the vocal level is mainly because at the vocal level, people aren't conscientiously praying. Now, I was guilty for that for many, many, many years, where I would just say, even liturgy of the hours, I would just be saying it and not conscientiously saying it. Now, how do you conscientiously say your prayers? Well, there's a couple things to understand. One is that a lot of times people focus on quantity and not quality. So quantity is not about the number of prayers or the long hours of prayers that you do, but it's the quality. Even if you were to talk about exercising, generally speaking, it's the quality that matters, not the quantity. Okay? So you want to do everything qualitatively, not quantitatively, when it comes to prayer. So that's one. The second is to slow down. Slow down when you're praying. Don't try to do it fast. No. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be. No, Our Father who art in heaven. And especially if you're new at praying, you want to pray slowly so that you are actually trying to understand each word or each phrase. Our Father. Wow, it's our Father. Not just my Father. Why is it our Father? The word our as opposed to mine. Okay, my Father. Okay, because God the Father wants all of us to be his children, who art in heaven. Wow, he's not here on earth, physically. He's there in heaven. Hallowed be thy name. What does hallowed mean? Well, I would look it up in the dictionary. Hallowed means to be holy. Holy is thy name. That means I shouldn't be using God's name in vain because it's holy. Holy is thy name. Thy kingdom come. What does that mean? I want that kingdom to come. I want his reign to be here on earth. And thy will be done. Not my will, but thy will. All of those. You slow down and you say those words. Okay? So it's conscientious praying, knowing what the words say and mean. And if you don't know what they mean, look it up in a dictionary or ask someone who might know what that means, even in a theological sense. Even a secular definition would help better than being ignorant to what the words really mean. Okay? You can get really even more crazy. Why should we say thou, or thy, or those instead of, other words that are more common to the English language? There's deep meanings even within those fancy words that you hear. So understanding that, doing a little bit of spiritual reading to understand all of that, and then using our conscience to say those words and know what those words are trying to say in those prayers. And I'm telling you, you're going to up your game in your prayer life once that happens. Now, I agree with you. Sometimes we don't have the exact amount of time to do that, or sometimes it might be a little bit dry in our prayer life, but we need to do that. And that will help us not be so dry in our prayer life. So what are some cautions that we can do about our prayer life? All right. So the one thing that I like to caution people about is it's not about quantity. Okay. I remember one time I met this woman. I mean, she was a very nice woman. And I remember her keychain, she had about, I want to say at least 50 different types of saint medallions, medals. I'll call saint medals. And I was like, wow. And she's like, yeah, I got this saint's medal, I got that saint medal, and that saint medal. And I think the keychain must have weighed at least 50 pounds because it had so many medals. Now, I point this out because sometimes we can get into this idea that quantity over quality, and that is not the case. It's better to have one or two medals, right? Like especially the miraculous medal, and one or two devotions, as opposed to trying to handle 6 million devotions that are out there. It's not going to work out. Have a handful of devotions and be dedicated and really, really, focus on it. I have, my main devotions Our Lady, and I have secondary devotions. I have a devotion to St. Jude. As a man who has to provide for his family, it's very important for me to have devotion to St. Jude, because he does help me out with my business world. St. Joseph is another devotion, so Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary, another good devotion. So have a few, not a lot. Some might be seasonal, like the Divine Mercy Novena, St. Joseph's Novena. They're kind of seasonal. So you're kind of going through the season with them, with these devotions. So don't worry so much on quantity, but quality. That's really, really important. Second is a caution is scrupulous. Okay, don't be over scrupulous if you miss something. Okay, I say 80-20 rule. I'm not saying that you should miss it 20% of the time, but what I mean by that 80-20, just generically speaking, is have some fault tolerance in your prayer life. Okay, especially in the beginning. If you get really hard on yourself, it's very easy to crack and break. All right. We all know that we live in a secular, we're secular Catholics. That means we kind of live in the world. We have children to take care of. It's very easy for friars and sisters to pray and be extremely regimented because they don't have the secular concerns. But we kind of do. So we have kids who are sick. We have our own sickness that we have to worry about. We have work that might happen. But we do have to understand, so there's some flexibility in the idea of our regimentality, but we want to focus that at least 90%, if not 95%, is regimen. There's going to be 5 to 10% that, you're going to have to bend to be flexible with, okay? But what you have to distinguish is flexibility as opposed to obliterating your regimental life or your prayer life, okay? If it goes beyond 90% of your life, then it's obliterating it as opposed to being flexible, okay? And then the third caution to worry about, which is very, very important, is the idea that the heart of prayer is love, okay? We are not to be mechanized in such a way that we don't use our hearts and our imagination and our love towards God. That's the whole purpose. This is the reason why I'm giving you the baseline of prayer, is hopefully that love will increase in our heart. And so we got to be careful how our prayer life impacts our excuse me, our secular world. And one rule that I always make about myself is that I don't make my prayer life a burden to my secular world. Okay, that's key to understand that. It's not a burden to them. All right, so I have to carve out my time. So instead of watching television, you do your prayers. Instead of maybe wanting to talk on the phone for an hour or two or on Facebook or whatever, there's a lot of time in your life that you have that you can carve out 15 minutes, all right? Or especially, a couple of minutes just to do a simple prayer. So we're not talking about hours and hours and hours of prayer. We're talking about carving out a certain piece. And you should not be a burden on your secular world. Like, you shouldn't be saying, well, I'm doing my prayer life, so I'm not going to cook you dinner right now. No. All right? I often wake up very early in the morning to do my prayer life, earlier than what I would need to do to handle just my secular world. So let's say I need to wake up at 6 o'clock just to handle my secular world. I'll wake up at 5:30. All right? That half hour before that 6 o'clock is time that I'm giving to God, and doesn't become a burden to my secular world. Okay? So It might be lunchtime during work where you take that 2 or 3 minutes to do the Angelus at work, before you do lunch, and yes, it might impact that you are only given 20 minutes for lunch or whatever it might be. So it's these things that you can do. So, but remember, it's always out of love. If you get interrupted because of the need to handle a secular crisis, maybe it's a sick child, maybe it's a work or something like that, don't get overscrupulous, don't get angry. Just understand that God interrupted you at that time. And you can get uninterrupted and then go back to that prayer again. That's it. All right? And not lose your peace among it. So I hope this was helpful. And I would like to end it with a prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Lord Jesus, we love you with all our heart, soul, and mind. Help us to make firm resolution to follow the baseline of prayer, going back to the basics, the fundamentals, so that we may grow in love towards you and to others. As we pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Thanks for listening to me, David Cease, at Practical Catholic. Here's a reflection for you. Take a moment and reflect on the basics of prayer. Do I need to focus on the basics? Feel free to share your reflection or leave a comment on the podcast, Instagram, and Facebook at Practical Catholic, or visit my webpage at practicalcatholic1, that is the number 1.com. Join me next week as we continue to discuss the prayer and focus on spiritual dryness.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.